In 1946, C.S. Lewis preached a sermon in which he was addressing the Anglican practice of confessing sin in worship and the kind of language that the prayer book uses when it talks about sin. Some of that language is out of date now, but much of it is the same that we find in our prayer books today. And in his sermon, Lewis acknowledged that for many modern people, this part of our worship feels uncomfortable and unattractive. Some people, he says, find it to be downright morbid and gloomy. I know what Lewis is talking about. On several different occasions, I've had church members ask me questions about this specific part of our service, this confessing sin, and why we insist on doing it every week. Why are we always talking about our sin? Why are we always expressing remorse about things that we've done and things we failed to do? After all, aren't we meant to be joyful? Shouldn't that be the focus of our worship? Can't we just celebrate God's grace and move on? I think those are good questions, and I can sympathize with the distaste that some people feel for this practice of constantly confessing sin. I don't personally look forward to kneeling down and publicly acknowledging my failures. I get it. I do. But whether we enjoy it or not, this part of our worship is absolutely essential. And in this video, I'd like to talk about why. Why are we always asking God to forgive us? And why is it good for us to do so? In 1973, the famed American psychiatrist Karl Menninger wrote a book entitled Whatever Became of Sin. The word sin, he said, was once a proud word. It was a strong word, an ominous and serious word, but the word went away. It has almost disappeared. The word along with the notion. Why? Doesn't anyone sin anymore? Doesn't anyone believe in sin? Of course, as a psychiatrist, Menninger understood the human condition well enough to know that what the Bible calls sin has not somehow miraculously disappeared from modern life. He knew that all the old vices, all of the vanity, the envy, greed, and anger, all that still haunts the human heart. And he knew how people act toward one another, how we can be vindictive and jealous, bitter and resentful. He knew about the petty and spiteful things that we say to each other, and even worse, things that we think about each other. He knew that people haven't really changed. He wasn't denying it. But what Karl Menninger realized is that we have changed the way we think about it. Because today, instead of talking about sin, we talk about syndromes, about disorders and dysfunctions that we suffer. Today, we tend to think of ourselves not first and foremost as guilty individuals who must take responsibility for our wrongdoing, but as people who have been hurt and wounded, the victims of our own past hardships, or maybe the victims of our personality traits. We live in a therapeutic society, and often we act as our own therapists by telling ourselves that we're not really so bad, and we shouldn't feel so ashamed, and we really shouldn't be so hard on ourselves. At least that's what Karl Menninger thought. But that's very different from thinking in the categories of sin, isn't it? And Karl Menninger's not the only one to point this out. Just listen to these words by Cornelius Plantinga. The awareness of sin used to be our shadow. Christians hated sin, feared it, fled from it, grieved over it. Some of our grandparents agonized over their sins. A man who lost his temper might wonder whether he could still go to Holy Communion. But the shadow has dimmed. Where sin is concerned, people mumble now. And that's a tragedy, according to Plantinga. Not because he thinks that Christians ought to be endlessly engaged in some kind of morbid introspection or constantly fearful of the judgment of God. On the contrary, he says that we must never forget the grace of God. But to speak of grace without sin, he adds, is surely no better. To do this is to trivialize the cross of Jesus Christ. to skate past all the struggling by good people down the ages to forgive, accept, and rehabilitate sinners, including themselves, and to cheapen the grace of God that always comes to us with blood on it. When we come together, we should always be ready to remember and celebrate the grace of God in Jesus Christ. But let us never cheapen that grace. Let us never forget the weight of sin. If you look at worship in the Bible, you'll find that these two things are always present together. When God's people come to pray and worship, they come with the expectation that they will find mercy and grace. But they also come in humility. They come with contrition, acknowledging their faults. Just think of the Psalms in the Bible. There's a lot of joy and celebration of God's grace in the Psalms, but there's also a lot of frank talk about sin. That's especially true in the so-called penitential Psalms, like Psalm 6, which begins, "O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath." Or Psalm 130, "If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared." Or even more memorably, Psalm 51, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me." That psalm not only offers a wonderful model of genuine remorse and confession of sin, it also articulates the role that contrition should play in worship. "For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." Of course, the people of Israel didn't need those psalms to tell them that when they gathered for worship, they had to face their sins, because they already had the sacrificial system. In the book of Leviticus, God had given his people a very detailed set of instructions on all of the sacrifices that should accompany their worship. Now, some of those sacrifices were meant to be expressions of thanksgiving and celebration, but many of them were intended to deal with the reality of sin and guilt. When the Israelites came to worship the Lord, they had to bring animals with them, sheep, goats, bulls, even doves, animals that would be killed and offered on an altar as an atonement for their sins. Of course, that doesn't mean that God was angry and refusing to show mercy to them until they gave him a proper sacrifice. He had already shown mercy to them. Theirs wasn't some kind of quid pro quo relationship with God. You do this for me, I do that for you. God had always shown them mercy, and he had already promised to forgive them. But he also took them seriously. He didn't minimize their sin, and he wanted them to take themselves seriously and to understand what it takes for sinners to come into the presence of a holy God. But you might say, well, that was a long time ago. It's been thousands of years since God's people offered sacrifices on altars to atone for their sins. Haven't we gotten away from all that? But I'd say, well, wait a minute, not so fast. It's true that we don't slaughter any animals in our worship, but what do we do instead? We remember Jesus' death. When he bore our sins once for all in his body on the cross, when he became the perfect sacrifice, as the New Testament says, and we receive the gift of his body and blood. In his letter to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says that every time we do that, every time we eat the bread and drink the cup, we are proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. Every time we celebrate the Lord's Supper, we're proclaiming the Lord's death. And to whom are we proclaiming it? Who is the audience? Well, in a worship service, presumably ourselves. We're preaching to ourselves, reminding ourselves of God's grace and forgiveness, remembering the cost of that forgiveness, but also, don't forget this, we're also reminding ourselves of why we need that forgiveness. Every time we receive the bread and drink the cup, we are being reminded, just like those ancient Israelites were reminded, that we're not just people who've been wounded. We're not just people who have made some mistakes, but we are guilty sinners who deserve God's judgment and who desperately need the atonement that He has provided. So you see, it's not just in our prayers that we're asking forgiveness. It's not just in those moments when we confess that we have sinned in thought, word, and deed, or when we say, "Forgive us our trespasses." Worship is saturated with reminders that we are the guilty. And it is saturated with opportunities to beg God for mercy. But why is this so important? And why is it good for us to do this? Now, you could give a lot of answers to that question, but I'd like to focus on just two. Two reasons that asking forgiveness is good for us. First, it's good because it teaches us to be thankful. In the 5th century, St. Augustine wrote his very famous memoir of his life that he called Confessions. And the reason he called it that is because he actually wrote the whole thing in the form of a prayer. And much of that prayer was a confession, because in it he was remembering and recounting many of his greatest failures and his worst sins, and he was acknowledging them publicly to God, which leads him, as he's writing it, to feel naked and vulnerable before God. As he puts it at one point, "To you then, Lord, I lie exposed, exactly as I am." But why do that? Why write this confession? Augustine actually takes up that question later in the book, and his answer is a very interesting one. He says that the reason that he is confessing his sin like this is because doing so enables him to be overwhelmed and to marvel once again at the kindness and love that God shows him in forgiving and restoring him. He's not just remembering his sin, he is remembering God's grace. And it teaches him to be thankful for God's mercy and in gratitude to love God in return. Why then am I relating all of this sin to you at such length? He finally asks. Certainly not in order to inform you, he says to God. I do it to arouse my own loving devotion toward you and that of my readers, so that together we may declare, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised." Confessing sin and asking forgiveness is uncomfortable. It is unenjoyable. No one likes to dwell on their failures. But Augustine doesn't find it to be a burden. He actually finds it to be life-giving. Because, like us, he knows that whenever he confesses his sin, he knows that God has promised to forgive him. And he learns that actually the process of asking forgiveness helps him to wonder and gives him gratitude all over again as he experiences the goodness and love of God. Confession doesn't make him miserable. Confession leads him to celebrate and to sing, "Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised." And the same is true for us. It is good for us to confess our sins and ask for forgiveness because it teaches us to be thankful. But it's also good because it teaches us to forgive. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells a story about two men. One is a devoutly religious man. He's a member of the Pharisees. And the other is a man who makes his living by defrauding his fellow Jews, a tax collector. And Jesus says that one day both these men go to the temple and they're praying. The tax collector's prayer is very simple. He's a man who knows his faults. He feels remorse, contrition, and he begs God for forgiveness. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. The Pharisee is different because he doesn't think of himself as a sinner. He thinks of himself, at least relatively, he's a devout man who does his very best to obey God. So when he prays, what he says is, "God, I thank you that I am not like other men extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. When Jesus is telling this story, he says nothing that would lead us to think that what the Pharisee is saying isn't true. The Pharisee does seem to be doing much better than other men. He's not some notorious wrongdoer. He is dutiful in his devotion to God. And he's generous and he's obedient with his tithes. And yet, despite that, Jesus says that it is not this Pharisee with whom God is pleased that day, but the tax collector. Because while the tax collector may have been guilty of many wrongs, he did understand his desperate need for mercy. The Pharisee thought he needed none. And because of that, he was pretty merciless in his judgment toward others. And that's why confessing sin and asking for forgiveness is so important. Because when we don't do it, when we don't regularly name our sins, when we don't feel contrition, when we don't recognize our need for mercy, then we become ever less merciful to those around us. As C.S. Lewis put it in that sermon that I mentioned earlier, those who do not think about their own sins make up for it by thinking incessantly about the sins of others. When Jesus' disciples asked him to teach them to pray, he taught them to say, "Forgive us our trespasses," or "Forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us." Interestingly, it's precisely in asking for forgiveness, precisely in begging God for mercy that we don't deserve, but that he freely gives. It's in doing that we actually become people who are ready and quick to offer forgiveness to others.